been working with Carolina and Mauricio for a few years now, and yet I have never been to Costa Rica. So I should probably fix that one day. As Anthony mentioned, I've heard nothing but good things about the country. So I should make my way there at some point now that I have a real job and can probably afford a holiday. Um, but I am here to talk about today a really exciting project I did with them where we worked on trying to turn some of what I know about cognitive bias and the research on cognitive bias into actual actionable steps that could be used in a lab. And so I'm going to start off the webinar meeting today with an introduction to some of that research. I'm going to keep it quite short because C-Safe Learning has other lessons that you can take that actually do feature me as well. Not that I'm trying to plug my own content, but I think it's pretty good. If you want to know more about cognitive bias, you can go there, but I'm going to go through some of the research and the solutions just to give some background. Then Carolina is going to take over and talk about how they worked through the problems that arise when you try to actually move these types of things into practice. And then we'll finish off with Mauricio sharing some of the benefits of doing this. So just to begin, I'm going to talk about what cognitive bias is. A lot of people have an idea of what it is. It is sort of mystified a little bit, I think, sometimes in forensic science. So there are some very technical ways to describe it and then some less technical ways. So I'm going to start with a technical definition that someone might put into a journal article or something like that, that is very precise and thorough, but potentially not so easy to understand. So cognitive bias is a class of effects by which someone's pre-existing beliefs, expectations, and motives, or the situational context may influence their collection, perception, or interpretation of new information, or their judgments, decisions, or confidence about the new information. So this is the definition that the Human Factors Task Group on the OSAC group has come up with and agreed upon, but it is very long and complicated. And it can be summarized in easier language. So I like to also talk about what it means without the jargon. And really, all cognitive biases is things that you already know or what you're expecting to happen, regardless of where those clues come from. These will influence how you interact with new information and also how you feel about your evaluations of those new pieces of information. And there's lots of different things that cognitive bias has been called. Cognitive bias is kind of an umbrella term, but you might have heard other types of words used to describe it. You might have heard of system one, which is system one, system two being the more deliberate, careful, slow decision making. But system one is basically the automatic cognitive bias type decision making. You also have heuristics, top-down processing, naive theories, automatic processing. These are all slightly different things, but they're all referring to the same type of decision-making process. So don't be confused if you see these other words sometimes referring to what you think is the same type of process. And the other thing to note is that cognitive bias really has the largest effect under situations where you might be uncertain. So where you are dealing with some kind of ambiguous situation, you're dealing with a situation where you don't have enough information to really make a truly informed decision. Or maybe it's just not even clear that there is one answer to something. Those are the situations where this kind of process will have the largest effect. It's also the situation where it's the most useful to use that kind of decision process because you are missing information. But that does mean that there's more room for subjective judgments and perception and other information that maybe is only tangentially relevant to inform your opinion or conclusion and sort of fill in the gaps in your knowledge and the information available to you. Another thing that's important to note is that cognitive bias isn't actually a bad thing. It's sort of got a negative connotation with it now, particularly in forensic science, and I think people are sort of afraid of it a little bit. There's no need to be afraid of it. It is just a natural, normal decision-making process that's actually very useful in a lot of situations. We wouldn't be able to move through the world without cognitive bias processes. They allow us to make efficient, quick decisions. They also occur largely outside of our awareness. That's also important because we can't be constantly cognitively effortful in every decision that we make. But because they occur outside of our awareness, they're much harder to keep track of, maybe control. And it's also what makes it so interesting for people like me to study because they're just sort of happening, and the solutions to them are much more complicated. So hopefully that gives you guys some background on what cognitive bias is. And just to sort of illustrate what I'm talking about in a different way without words, if we're talking about ambiguous information, that could be something like a latent fingerprint, or it could be a DNA sample from a crime scene. It could be tire tracks. It could be any kind of forensic evidence you're trying to deal with. And the question is like, is this the same as another piece of evidence? Is this the same as a suspect sample? And that's a ambiguous situation because you don't always have perfect information you're dealing with. And so the decision is one you're making under sort of situations that are ambiguous. And so because of that, the different information people have access to, the different mindsets they might be in, the different training that they have, maybe even just if they're fatigued that day. These are all things that can influence how they perceive that ambiguous information. So that means that the same person could make different decisions about the same evidence across time, or different people could make different decisions about the same information. And that's not ideal. So under really, really ambiguous situations, you might see different interpretations of evidence. And you might have seen this sort of chart before. I'm not going to go through it in detail because it's not necessary to. You can also find out more about each of these sort of steps of this triangle if you go to other C-Safe learning opportunities. But basically what I'm trying to show here is that there's different types of bias. And so at the top here, we have bias effects that would affect just a specific case. So things about that specific case and the materials in that case that will influence the decisions about that case. And they're not going to bleed over into other cases very often. It's pretty rare for that to happen. However, as you move further down the triangle, you start to get into types of bias that might influence more cases than just one. So these ones here, these are the kinds of biasing effects that might affect everyone in a particular laboratory or every case that a particular person interacts with. So these are ones that are sort of more widespread effects, but they're also further removed from a particular case, and thus the effects might be smaller. And then even further out is you have things that are just about people. And so when people are making decisions, we're going to have these types of bias happening because people make decisions in particular ways. They might be influenced by personal factors or individual differences, such as risk aversion. Someone who's more risk averse is going to be both less likely to gamble, but also less likely to make a conclusive decision under situations where they don't really have enough information. So those are things that are just about people that might influence decisions that can be classified as a biasing effect. And a final note about bias is just that people tend to recognize that bias is an issue. So you can see at the top here, 71% of people said that yes, cognitive bias is a concern in forensic sciences as a whole. So these were forensic scientists asked to consider cognitive bias in forensic science. And so a lot of them were willing to say that it's a problem in forensic science as a whole. But then as you get closer and closer to their own discipline. So in your specific domain of forensic science, is it an issue? We have it down to 52% of people agreeing with that. And then if they had to consider their own judgments, people were less likely to say, yes, that's an issue. And this sort of shows a bias blind spot that people aren't so willing to recognize that bias could affect their own decisions. But that's kind of to be expected because remember, I said that it occurs outside of our awareness. So we wouldn't be aware that bias is affecting us. So that's probably why we're seeing this pattern here, but that's something to keep in mind. So that's cognitive bias. Now I'm going to get into some solutions, some of the solutions that Carolina and her team worked through and considered when they were trying to see what they could implement. So the first one is just awareness training or ongoing education about bias. And this is something that comes up a lot in policies. People suggest doing awareness training a lot, and awareness training is really great. It's important for people to understand bias effects and how they occur, even if you're an expert, because without that understanding, you're not going to understand why it's important to do any of the other kinds of interventions that might be in place. So it's really important to understand bias. But unfortunately, alone, awareness training is going to be insufficient to protect against bias because, like I said, it occurs outside of our awareness. So willpower alone is not going to be enough. You can't just try hard enough and then not be biased, unfortunately. But awareness training is still a really good first step in any sort of implementation of cognitive bias mitigation strategies. Another common thing that's talked about in the literature is blind verifications. And I have to note that non-blind verification alone is not enough. It's not bad to do non-blind verification, but it is insufficient to really catch any of these cognitive bias effects that might run through a lab. So really the second examiner needs to be blind to avoid any sort of confirmation and contextual biases that might affect them. Otherwise, they would be inclined to just agree with the first examiner, even if they don't realize it. And this is a great implementation strategy, but it is a little bit sort of difficult to organize depending on the size of the lab. And also it can slow down processing time. So it's a cost benefit analysis, as Carolina will talk more about. Blind proficiency testing is also really important. So this is where a fake case where ground truth is known is sent through the system as if it's a real case. And this is great because it doesn't just test the examiner, it tests the whole system in a lab. But it is very difficult to do well and very expensive. I'm only aware of one lab who has sort of managed to consistently run blind proficiency testing in some of their units, and that's the Houston Forensic Science Center. And if you read some of their papers about this, it's incredibly difficult to do well. But it is a very, very effective and wonderful thing to implement if you can. Another really important thing to do is standardize protocols and procedures as much as is practical, because this will, on its own, have a lot of value. Even if you don't have anything else going on, when you standardize how people approach tasks and what cutoffs they use and criterion they use, then this will enhance consistency across cases and repeatability and reproducibility within the lab and between examiners. Information management protocols and policies are also very helpful. There's lots of different kinds that have occurred in, not just forensic science. There's medical field ones, there's ones in risk assessment. But specific to forensic science, we have linear sequential unmasking and linear sequential unmasking expanded. You might have heard of these before. Basically, they're really helpful in a lot of ways, but they're ideally used to triage cases. But this isn't always feasible in labs. So that would be going through the cases before they get to the examiner to remove anything that's potentially irrelevant or to withhold things that they maybe shouldn't get till later. The other sort of things to take away from information management protocols is that they typically recommend detailed documentation of decision-making steps, and then also what they had access to at those steps, and just transparency. In addition, linear sequential unmasking expanded really sort of encourages people to think and consider the biasing power, the level of subjectivity, and the relevance of all of the information available to them. And if they can't exclude things that are maybe problematic, at least acknowledging that and trying to figure out how they might mitigate the effects, even though they've already been exposed to the information. And I'm not going to go into detail about it, but I have made a worksheet to help people work through linear sequential unmasking expanded, and I've provided some training materials too. This is in a publication that was in 2022. So this is the worksheet. You can see you just put in the type of information where it came from, consider each of these guiding principles, and then, what you might do if they're at all problematic. Some steps that you might have taken to mitigate the effects of them. And the final thing to consider is the use of case managers and triage, which is in line with what I said for linear sequential unmasking. This could be another examiner or someone in management or even someone in quality control. They can be responsible for talking to law enforcement and attorneys and kind of refining the information that is provided to the examiner before they get it, and also refining the analytic request as well, without having a lot of back and forth with the people who know a lot more about the case than maybe the examiner should. And then this person can also determine what's necessary, what should be withheld, what should be provided later. And they can also use the linear sequential unmasking expanded worksheet that I just showed you to help them do this, or at least as a training tool to figure out how to do this well. So all of these solutions have a lot of research behind them, but there's still a pretty big gap between research and practice. So that's kind of why we're here today. Researchers like me don't really have a lot of experience working with laboratories. I don't know how a lab works or how it should be run, and I also don't have a business background. I don't have an economics background, so this is all quite hard for me to think about in terms of practicalities. However, I can try to make recommendations. I can try to make things like the worksheet, but there's still a lot of room for things to go to develop before they can actually be put up in a lab. And then laboratories typically don't have human factors experts on staff to help them translate the research that we publish into practice. So this is where the Department of Forensic Sciences in Costa Rica has really come in and filled that gap. They're closing this gap in a way that researchers like me cannot, and using sort of multiple approaches that I've just talked about that have different pros and cons, and figuring out how to do that in the best way possible. So I'm really excited now to hand over to Carolina. We have a published paper on this topic too, if you want to access it. It's free to access, it's open access in FSI Synergy. And these are our email addresses, but you can always contact us as well later. So I'm going to hand over to Carolina now. And thank you so much for being here.
So I will share my screen. Just to make sure, can you see it? Great. Okay. Well, I first want you to have like a overview of the country and specifically from our lab. So we're approximately 5.3 million people in the country, and the population is primarily concentrated in the urban areas with a significant percentage living in the capital city, San Jose. We only have one forensic lab for the whole country. We have 220 members, 8 sections in the department, and we have like maybe 33,000 reports per year. So, and also just to give you an overview of why we are managing this project and a bit of our experience, Mauricio is the lab director with extensive expertise in forensic sciences and also leadership, and particularly in areas like quality management, project implementation, process optimization. And as for me, I've been with the lab for several years, and now I'm part of the project management office, overseeing projects related to developing of new methodologies and improving systems for greater efficiency. So we have a comprehensive view of the department, with Mauricio leading the lab's vision and guiding the team toward achieving these goals. So I just want to have a quick test. Let's take a moment to explore and reflect on what we perceive. So I'd like to ask for you to put your input and perspective on this. So please write what you think or see in the chat as I go through some of these questions. So first, what do you see in this image? Please just can you put your input in the chat? Okay. Okay. Bird, dog, bird, dog. Okay. Great. Now, what about now? Okay. So many of you could change. Okay, now we're seeing rabbit, rabbit, still both. Okay, so it depends on how things are presented to us and the information we're provided. This will shape and influence how we interpreted them. Okay, then we have this image, in color, black or white and white. What do you think? Color, black and white. Color, color, color. Okay. Many of you color. Great. Color. Okay. So this is a visual illusion image that demonstrates how our perception of color can be tricked. The image shows only one girl in the center, holding an object appearing to be in color, specifically her yellow shirt, and everyone else seems to be in black and white. But some of the shirts appear color as well. So what's happening here? The entire image is actually in grayscale. It's not in color, but there's a color grid overlay, red, green, or blue, on top of this grayscale photo. So we have this illusion of color arises because of our brains interpret the small colored grid lines as tinting the grayscale underneath. So this is called color simulation, or the Munker-White illusion. And what I think this is fascinating is it illustrates how context and surroundings influence perception. Okay. Another question, do you consider bias to be a cause of concern in your field? Okay. What of yes? Specifically, and do you believe your own judgments are influenced by bias? Another one. Can be. Some situations, no. think we have more yes in the first question. So just a quick reflection about, okay. Awareness alone of one's own bias does not prevent its impact on decision-making unless system-level policies are in place to detect, understand, and address errors. So this statement reflects the core reason behind our approach. This is like our why. This statement underscores a powerful idea for us and why being aware of our own biases is important. It's simply not enough to prevent them from affecting our decisions. So we all heard that awareness is the key, but in reality also it's the systematic intervention that is needed. So and finally, there are policies, strategies that go beyond individual awareness. They are about creating a structure that helps identify, understand, and manage bias. So we need process in place that detect when bias is affecting decisions, help us understand how it works, and provide ways to correct it. For us, every time we mitigate bias, we protect the truth and we protect justice and the public trust in forensic science. So just a quick overview of the risk evaluation process that we have. First, we identified potential risks, explored the critical sources of cognitive contamination. Then we evaluate the gravity and risk of bias. We use a methodology to assess the severity of the risks and their potential impact on forensic science, forensic analysis. Then we prioritize our actions, focus on actions that will provide the greatest benefit while minimizing resource investment. And finally, we implement the effective solutions, ensure that mitigation strategies are integrated into existing workflows for minimal disruptions. So we had our flowchart development of the different processes for question documents. These flowcharts were then used to identify potential sources and the corresponding levels of contextual information at each step of the process. The flowcharts were developed through collaborative working sessions with the section team. This process enables a more precise identification of risks and exposure to biased information at each stage. Then we had working sessions with the team to identify the potential sources of cognitive contamination in the section's processes. Using Dror's taxonomy sources were visually marked in the flowcharts. We have these symbols and color codes, making it easier to spot the most critical risks. And then a color code was applied to indicate the risk level associated with each source. So we had red for very high risk, yellow for medium risk, and this risk was evaluated using the methodology proposed by Dror and Pearce. So they suggested a risk matrix that evaluates the risk of bias in relation to the severity of its effects. So for each source, the question document section staff was asked to provide their expert opinion on the classification of the source type and the risk associated with each one. And finally, we have a brainstorming session, where the staff was asked to propose possible ways or actions to mitigate the cognitive contamination detected in each source. So here is what the team created with flowcharts of different processes for question documents. The flowcharts were developed during focus sessions between the question documents group and the project team. These flowcharts permitted the team to identify steps in the processes that were likely to be more vulnerable to bias in information and what types of contextual information examiners could be expected to receive. And this stage at these stages of the process. Then we have brainstorming sessions. So first we have this collaborative brainstorming through with the team. We explored possible actions to mitigate the identified sources of cognitive contamination. We had more than 45 proposed ideas where to address the cognitive bias sources that we detected. And then the goal was to develop a wide range of strategies and solutions to reduce the impact of cognitive contamination on forensic decision making. So a Pareto diagram was created to prioritize efforts and resources by relating action categories for mitigating bias to the number of identified contamination sources. So our key actions with greatest impact, we have cognitive bias management policies those are like organizational guidelines designed to limit the exposure of examiners to irrelevant or biased information that could influence their decision making. These policies aim to standardize how information is managed throughout the forensic process, ensuring that only relevant information is provided to examiners for their specific task. The goal is to reduce the chances of external or irrelevant factors such as case context influencing the objective analysis of evidence. So as an example, from the article includes a policy in question documents section that where the location for taking writing samples was moved to a different area, separate from the primary section where the analysis took place. This was done to prevent examiners from being exposed to information related to the suspect or case context during the collection of the sample. So we were able to reduce the potential for bias. So additionally, the person who collects the writing sample should not be the one assigned to analyze the case. This is because the sample collector receives all these case-related information from the person who is handling the case, so which could unconsciously influence their examination. Also, we had training sessions to raise awareness of the risks associated with bias in forensic casework. Examiners were educated on how this bias can contaminate forensic analysis and decision making. And additionally, training on cognitive contamination in forensic work was also implemented to help staff recognize and address biases. A key part of this training was the worksheet for linear sequential masking expanded implementation, which provided a structured framework for controlling the flow of information and reducing bias during the forensic examination process. We just want to make sure that examiners understand and recognize cognitive bias. Then we have the case manager role that we aimed at managing the information that examiners receive during case analysis. In our case, the case manager acts as a point of contact between judicial authorities and examiners, filtering and organizing the information to ensure that only relevant details are provided to the examiner for their analysis. So this approach ensures that examiners are not influenced by irrelevant details, which could introduce unwanted biases. And then we have blind verification. Blind verifications provide like this an independent check on the initial examiner's decision. The verifier is blind to the conclusion that the initial examiner made, or is not informed of the initial examiner's conclusion, so they're not anchored to the initial examiner's opinion or expecting a particular outcome. For this strategy, we amended the existing verification process. The new verification process is carried out through the case manager. The verifier or forensic expert is shielded from information that is not necessary for the execution of the examination and the verification. So if any discrepancies are detected, the case manager is responsible for convening both parties to resolve the issue. So here you can see how applying the action categories labeled as cognitive bias, management policies, training, case manager, and blind verification, we could address approximately the 80% of the potential sources of cognitive bias identified during the assessment. So thus, focusing on resources on these categories was likely to result in the most value and benefit. And then this project also presented many challenges for us to the department, because any proposal needed to be practical, needed to be feasible to ensure they would enhance the work coming out of the lab rather than compound existing issues with resources. So before implementing the proposed strategies, of feasibility study was conducted to evaluate the required investment, the time, the resources, the budget, the anticipated benefits to increase objectivity, reduce bias, and also the available resources in the department to ensure the proposed strategies were practical and sustainable. And sadly, despite the promising potential of blind testing as a bias mitigation strategy, we encountered practical challenges that made it unfeasible for lab to implement the blind proficiency testing. Creating this was a plan chosen as a strategy because it will mean that we could evaluate policies and error rates within the lab by sending more cases that make routine cases. But these tests, we want to have not just, we want to have a supplement, we want to supplement inter-laboratory tests as they serve different purpose. Blind proficiency tests can help monitor the risk of bias, evaluate examiner competency, and test the validity of the methods used in the lab. They can also reveal areas for improvement in the lab, environment, and culture, or regarding the internal policies used by the lab. When people know they are being tested, they tend to behave in ways that they think they are supposed to act rather than how they ordinarily would. So this is why we will love to have this program, but this was not implemented due to the significant financial costs involved in creating realistic test cases and submission materials. Costa Rica has a single forensic lab that serves the entire population, and despite the potential benefits of implementing blind proficiency testing, we were not able to justify the resource investment that will have been required. And I'll now turn it over to Mauricio.
Thank you, Carolina. Good morning to all. So as Carolina mentioned, let me share my screen. Is that okay? Can you see the screen? No? No. Let me. No. I think now it's okay. Yes. Okay, thank you. So, as Carolina mentioned, when implementing bias mitigation measures, it is essential for us to balance their effectiveness with operational efficiency. Accordingly, these strategies should not overburden resources, disrupt workflows, or complicate operational tasks, and they should be straightforward to implement. Additionally, we aim to ensure that the strategies developed in the question document section can be scaled to other laboratories with more staff and higher case volumes, an aspect that must also be considered. So as part of the implementation and following the analysis conducted, we aim to develop strategies that could address various risks simultaneously, allowing multiple sources of bias to be mitigated in a single action. For example, implementing the linear sequential unmasking worksheet enabled us to address 4 sources of cognitive risk, 3 classified as high risk and 1 as very high. Similarly, conducting blind verifications make it possible to address 5 of the identified risks, all classified as high risk. This enables us to be effective in our actions, maximizing the benefits. To illustrate the effects of the actions taken, we would like to share a case study. It involves an apparent forgery of a signature on a document. According to the complainant, her sister forged their mother's signature to transfer shares. It was necessary to determine whether the signature of the questioned share certificate was made by the person. So, according to the timeline, the request was initially received without major complexity. However, the complainant requested that an external expert participate in the process to review documentation and work procedures. It is important to note that this external expert was a former head of the question document section. At that time, the linear sequential unmasking expanded worksheet was applied, and it was determined that the expert in charge of the case would not be the one to attend to the external expert. Before the implementation of bias mitigation measures, it would have been standard practice for the same expert conducting the analysis to also interact with the external expert. The report was issued, and later a new request was received asking for the examination to be repeated by different experts. In a pre-project context, the second expert would have had access to the first report. As a consequence of the mitigation actions taken, sources of bias were identified, a different expert was assigned to the examination, and measures were taken to prevent this new expert from having access to information from the first report. Okay. So, as a result of the implementation, the following was achieved. 7 process flowcharts were developed for the analysis of handwritten documents. 33 potential sources of cognitive contamination were identified, the main one being irrelevant contextual information. Of the 33 potential sources, 22 were classified as high or very high. Importantly, the actions were incorporated into the quality management system documents, in the section SOPs, and in the quality manual, which is a general document for the entire department. It should be noted that the intention is to extend, as we mentioned, this project to all laboratories within the Costa Rican Forensic Science Department. The S symbol was incorporated into each document within the quality management system to identify elements related to actions addressing bias. It must be considered that our quality management system integrates at the moment the requirements of ISO 17020, ISO 17025, ILAC G19, and sections 1 and 2 of ISO 21043. To date, a total of 34 discrepancies have been found, of which 4 are considered opposing conclusive results. A total of 262 blind verifications have been conducted, Ongoing training is maintained, and a proactive and continuous improvement attitude is upheld regarding the implemented measures. As key takeaways, we can highlight the following. Mitigating cognitive bias in forensic science is both feasible and effective. Strategies such as the linear, sequential, and masking expanded worksheet, blind verifications, and the use of case managers offer the greatest impact. Ongoing training and continuous evaluation are essential for long-term success, and laboratories should prioritize bias mitigation strategies based on available resources. Recently, NIST issued a special publication 1500-28 called Informational Scientific Primers for Officers of the Court, intended to strengthen use of forensic science evidence. This document highlights, by addressing human factors across these areas, organizations can improve the quality of the results while reducing errors. Bias can significantly influence sampling, testing, observations, data interpretation, and conclusions. Finally, it is important to consider that international standards emphasize taking actions regarding bias. ISO 21043-4, published last June, states in Section 4, General Requirements, interpretation shall be designed to reduce the risk of cognitive bias, including the risk of influence of information that is not task relevant. Well, finally, we would like to thank CSAFE for the invitation to participate on this webinar and for the opportunity to share our experience throughout this process, recognizing that there is still much work ahead. And of course, our gratitude goes to Dr. Adele Quigley-McBride for her support in the development of the article and the guidance she has provided throughout this time. Thank you very much, and that will be all from our side. Thanks. I will stop sharing my screen. Okay.
Thanks so much. So if anybody has questions for any of us, feel free to either, unmute and ask us a question. You'll have to request to unmute, so maybe put it in the chat, or type your question in the chat if you'd rather not speak aloud. But also, if you think of something in the future that you have questions about, you're welcome to contact any of us about that. In addition, there are probably some resources that are translated into Spanish if that's something that you are interested in getting access to, and you should contact Carolina and Mauricio for that. I see we have one question here about what if the lab only has one person, and that is a practical concern that's come up a lot when people have asked me about this kind of thing. So I'll give a brief answer about what I think is possible there, but maybe Carolina and Mauricio will have more to say about that. So having only one person does mean that you can't do things like triage the information. You can't, have blind verifications unless you have another person at another lab that you can send your stuff to. But there are resources that help you to document the information you had access to and sort of walk you through considering how the information you have access to might influence your decisions. And also there's some specific mitigation techniques that you can do by yourself. So typically if someone only is alone in trying to mitigate bias in their decisions, I would suggest at a minimum training with the LSU e-worksheet. If you can, using it on occasion. I know it's a little bit time consuming to use, but it does provide a really good framework for documenting the information you have access to and thinking about it. And in particular, really spending time trying to consider alternative hypotheses and noting down why they don't work. based on the evidence in front of you. So spending time considering whether you could be wrong, and if you don't think you can be wrong, specifically saying why, because that sort of protects you later on. That's what the research says would be helpful, even if you're all by yourself. There might be other ways to do it, but those are the ones that I'm familiar with. I don't know if Carolina or Mauricio have anything to add to that.
Well, you're absolutely right. In cases where staffing limitations make blind verifications are unfeasible, but even when a single analyst handles the case, having clear documentation of what information was accessed, when, and why helps demonstrate intentionality in mitigating bias. So in our experience, you need having all this information, when was access, if you had access to that, when, and having even small adjustments like standardizing intake forms to filter this information can support mitigating bias. It's not always about removing everything and having someone else to do it for you, or helping or having someone as a filter. I think it will really helpful always to have everything, what kind of information you have access to, and having all this clear documented.
Maybe another thing is to keep the ongoing training. So maintain the awareness of the people about the situation of bias, about the possibility of bias. And also from the management point of view, there are some policies that the lab can define about the information that the expert and the lab needs to receive. Maybe that is important, along with other measures that can be taken. I saw in the chat also about a comment about using artificial intelligence. Well, in the future, that will be a field that could be applied to the artificial intelligence use.
Yeah, I think that the use of AI has a lot of potential, but I think we're still understanding how best to use this with people in labs. And I think once we understand fully how to do this efficiently in a practical way with people in charge of it, I don't think we should be relying on things that are maybe more of a black box, and therefore we might not fully understand how the AI is making decisions about the information. This is one situation where it would become apparent quite quickly if the AI wasn't doing a good job. So that in some ways is a good thing. It wouldn't be, it would be a bit more transparent, but I think there's a danger in relying on AI too much too early on in a process, particularly when we still don't fully understand how people use or interpret the information that AI gives us. So I think there's potential there, but be wary. So we have quite a few questions coming through. So this is one probably for Carolina and Mauricio. So Carol has asked where the changes implemented, were the changes implemented across all disciplines or just some, and were there challenges getting buy-in from the staff? So I think you mentioned it was just the question document section, but I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, it was only implemented first. We have this pilot program for the question documents section. Then we decided to be that one where the risk because the risk of cognitive bias was considered higher due to the nature of the examination, particularly because they involve recognition, subjective. You can tell the interpretation comes from the examiner. We focus on handwriting examination, where we had already documented the specific sources of contextual bias and had mapped the entire case processes. And then now we are trying to scale this to the whole department. We go one section at a time, and the plan is to have the whole mitigation process for the 8 sections of the department, but we started first with the question document section. It helped us a lot to, to have all these lessons from the process implementation, what it works, what it could work for us, what it couldn't. And then now we're moving to another section, and that's our goal, to be able to implement the whole the plan for the 8 sections. And also we're working one at a time, getting to know each section, their flow, how they work, the processes. We use disclosures to identify specifically the sources of what sources of bias they could have in the section. Each section is different. They have their own ways, different in their processes. Of course, we have this quality management system for everyone, but they have different processes, different evidence to handle. So that's how we are working right now.
Yeah, and I think
okay.
No, you say.
Is one more question before that one, I think, from Mallory.
Oh, here, yeah. What about using an intake form that asks specific questions to the investigator that will limit the information provided to you? So I think that that's sort of what the case manager is doing, and you could sort of standardize that a little bit with a form. One thing that I've learned from talking to forensic examiners and people who work in lab management and stuff like that is that it can sometimes be difficult to limit investigators in what they provide to you and how much information they try to impart to the examiners themselves. Now, that's typically not because they're for nefarious reasons. It's because they're trying to be helpful. But I think that they will maybe dislike that. So it is good to still have a person or some other way as an intermediary to check that those forms have been filled out in a way that's not going to be problematic. But that would help. Every little thing helps. But like Carolina said, like you want to be trying to be efficient with the changes that you make. You want to try and select things that are going to have widespread impact and, ideally be as little work as possible, but when they are in place, they're effective. And so, things like just asking people to abide by a worksheet is sometimes not going to work unless they have somebody checking them consistently. So I don't know what you have to say about that, Carolina and Mauricio, but sometimes relying on other people to do a good job of things is not the best way to do it.
Yes, I think for us, that's one of the most effective and maybe low-cost strategies. We decided we want to raise awareness, and we guided investigators to provide only the information that is relevant to this particular stage. So this helps to prevent inclusion of unnecessary or biasing contextual details, like suspect identities or prior results from other disciplines, or so we do want to be really intentional that please only they handle the task relevant information to us.
Yes, and we give continuous training to the investigators, and we use a standardized form. So we teach in the training how to fill the form, trying to avoid that contextual information.
And I think the last question that we have at the moment is just Were there any proposed remediations? Were any of the proposed interventions beta tested before being implemented? And again, Carolina and Mauricio can take this on, but I believe that this sort of was a kind of first go at it by implementing it with the smallest unit. And also they did just a ton of work before actually getting anything rolled out. So that once it did get rolled out, they knew that it would be feasible and doable. So the planning on the front end was sort of integral to actually making it work when it rolled out. But you guys can let them know what you think about that.
Well, yes, as you said, several of these proposed ideas were initially tested before broader implementation. We conducted this small scale test of these redesigned intake forms in the handwriting section. We observed how effectively they filtered cast irrelevant information. We also held these working sessions with examiners to evaluate when everything was going through the processes. We have feedback, and our approach also always is to emphasize that co-design like this with practitioners to ensure that the solutions were both like scientifically sound and operationally realistic. I think that's our approach by the moment.
All right, so I think we're even a little bit over time. So thank you all for hanging in with us while we answered some of the questions. And I'll hand back to Anthony, but please feel free to contact us if you have any more questions that come up, as I said earlier. So.
Good, Del. I just want to reiterate that we appreciate you three being here and sharing with the group. For those of you joining us today live, please know that the recording will be available within the next week. I am out of the office on parental leave for I don't know how long, but I will make sure that it gets done quickly, hopefully in the next week. So look forward to that. It will be hosted on CSAFE Learning as well, and I'll include the Q&A section in there. I would ask that you please consider filling out our quick feedback survey. I think it's 4 questions, was designed very intentionally to be quick so that we could get a little bit of feedback from you all. And while that may not impact CSAFE Learning immediately, that is feedback that we'll give back to Adele, Mauricio, and Carolina to let them know what you thought of today's session. Again, if you have any questions, please contact us. Otherwise, thank you all for being here. We hope you have a great day. It's no longer a remove all people. So I'm slowly removing people so we can debrief if you'd like.
Thanks, Anthony. I think that went really well. We went a little over time.